What if I told you that in 1993, a luxury apartment building in downtown Manhattan became the site of one of the most disturbing cover-ups in New York real estate history? What if I told you that for over 30 years, residents have been living above something so horrific that the city itself conspired to erase it from existence? Today, we're going to explore the Meridian Tower, a building that officially has 12 floors, but where some elevators still remember a 13th that was never supposed to exist. The Meridian Tower was completed in 1962, rising majestically from the corner of East 42nd Street, designed by renowned architect Harold Finch. It was meant to house New York's elite in its 144 luxury apartments. The building's marble lobby gleamed with imported Italian stone, and its brass elevators promised swift, silent ascent to any of its 12 floors. But there was something Harold Finch didn't tell his clients, something he buried in blueprints that were later mysteriously lost from city records. The building had 13 floors, but Margaret Chen was the first to notice something was wrong. In November of 1993, she moved into apartment 12, a corner unit with spectacular views of the Chrysler Building. Margaret was a structural engineer, and she had an eye for architectural details that most people missed. On her third night in the apartment, she was riding the elevator up from the lobby when she noticed something peculiar. She pressed the button for the 12th floor, but as the elevator climbed, she began counting the seconds. Having worked on dozens of buildings, Margaret knew that a standard elevator took approximately 4 seconds per floor. But her journey to the 12th floor was taking nearly a minute. She started timing it obsessively. Every trip up and down, she would count. The math didn't add up. The elevator was stopping somewhere it shouldn't be stopping. Margaret began asking her neighbors about it, but they all gave her the same response. The building had 12 floors. Always had, and she was probably just imagining things. The building manager, a stern man named Robert Kessler, became visibly agitated whenever she brought up her concerns. But Margaret wasn't the type to let things go. One evening in December, she decided to conduct an experiment. She would ride every elevator in the building and map out their timing patterns. The Meridian Tower had 4 elevators, 2 on each side of the lobby. The first elevator behaved normally. The second elevator behaved normally. The third elevator behaved normally. The fourth elevator was different. On the fourth elevator, when Margaret pressed any button above the 9th floor, the elevator would pause between what should have been the 12th floor and her destination. It would stop for exactly 37 seconds. The doors would remain closed, and then it would continue to her floor. During those 37 seconds, Margaret noticed something that made her blood run cold. She could hear sounds through the elevator walls, muffled voices, sometimes crying, sometimes what sounded like medical equipment beeping. Margaret started carrying a small recording device. Over the course of 3 weeks, she managed to capture hours of audio from these mysterious stops. When she played the recordings back, she could make out fragments of conversation. Patient number 7 is responding well to the new treatment. We need to increase the dosage. The family has stopped asking questions. How long until the next shipment arrives? Margaret realized she had stumbled upon something far more sinister than a simple architectural quirk. The 13th floor wasn't just hidden, it was being actively used. She began researching the building's history, spending countless hours at the New York Public Library, digging through newspaper archives and city planning documents. What she discovered changed everything. Harold Finch hadn't just been an architect. In the 1950s, he had been under investigation by the medical board for conducting unauthorized human experiments. The charges were dropped after several key witnesses mysteriously disappeared, but the rumors persisted throughout his career. Margaret found a 1961 newspaper article buried in the back pages of the New York Herald, with the headline, "Architect Finch partners with private medical research facility." The article mentioned that Finch's latest building would house a discrete medical research wing for patients requiring specialized long-term care. The article was dated 6 months before the Meridian Tower's construction began. Margaret realized that Harold Finch had built the 13th floor as a secret medical facility. But for what kind of patients? And why was it still operating 32 years later? She decided she had to see the 13th floor for herself. On a cold January night in 1994, Margaret waited until the building was quiet. She took the stairs down to the basement and found the building's maintenance area. After searching for nearly an hour, she found what she was looking for: a service elevator that was locked behind a heavy metal door. The lock was old and corroded. With some effort and a few tools she had borrowed from her engineering kit, Margaret managed to force it open. The service elevator was different from the passenger elevators. Instead of buttons for floors 1 through 12, it had buttons for basement, ground, floors 1 through 12, and at the top, a button marked simply M. Margaret pressed M. The elevator climbed slowly, much slower than the passenger elevators. She could feel it rising past the 12th floor, continuing upward until it finally stopped with a mechanical thud. The doors opened to reveal a corridor that looked like it belonged in a 1960s hospital. The walls were painted institutional green, and the floors were covered with cracked linoleum that had yellowed with age. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an eerie, unstable glow. Margaret stepped out of the elevator, her footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. The air smelled of disinfectant mixed with something else, something organic and unpleasant that she couldn't quite identify. There were doors along both sides of the corridor, each marked with a number: Room 1, Room 2, Room 3, and so on. She counted 16 rooms in total. The first few rooms appeared to be empty, their doors standing slightly ajar. Margaret could see hospital beds with rusted frames and medical equipment that looked decades out of date. But as she moved deeper into the corridor, she began to hear sounds: the steady beeping of monitors, the hiss of ventilators, and something that sounded like whimpering. Room 7 had its door closed, but light was seeping out from underneath. Margaret pressed her ear to the door and could hear voices inside, the same voices she had been recording from the elevator. The patient has been stable for 6 months now. Brain activity is minimal, but the body continues to respond to stimuli. Long has this one been here? Since 1978, one of our longest residents. Margaret's hands were shaking as she tried the door handle. It was unlocked. Inside room 7. She found something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The room contained a single hospital bed, surrounded by medical equipment that looked like it belonged in an intensive care unit. In the bed was what had once been a human being, but was now something else entirely. The patient, if they could still be called that, was connected to dozens of tubes and wires. Their body was emaciated, their skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and their eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. But they were breathing, and the monitors showed brain activity. Standing beside the bed were 2 people in white coats. They turned when Margaret entered, and she saw that their faces were covered by surgical masks. "I'm sorry," Margaret stammered. "I think I took a wrong turn." The 2 figures looked at each other, then back at Margaret. One of them reached for something on a nearby table, a syringe. Margaret ran. She sprinted back down the corridor to the elevator, but as she reached it, she heard footsteps behind her. The elevator doors were closing slowly, too slowly. She managed to slip through, just as they sealed shut. As the elevator descended, Margaret could hear pounding on the doors above, and voices shouting, but she couldn't make out the words. When she reached the basement, Margaret didn't stop running until she was back in her apartment. She locked the door, drew all the curtains, and sat in her kitchen, trying to process what she had seen. The next morning, Margaret called the police. She told them everything: the hidden 13th floor, the secret medical facility, the patient. In room 7, the officer who took her call was polite but skeptical. He promised to send someone to investigate. 3 days later, Margaret received a call from Detective James Morrison. He told her that they had investigated her claims thoroughly. The building had been searched from top to bottom, and there was no 13th floor. The elevators only went to the 12th floor, and the building manager had provided blueprints proving that the building had never had more than 12 floors. Detective Morrison suggested that Margaret might be under stress from her recent move, and recommended that she speak to a counselor. Margaret tried to return to the 13th floor, but she found that the service elevator had been sealed with welded metal plates. When she asked the building manager about it, he told her that the elevator had been condemned due to safety violations and would not be reopened. But the regular passenger elevator, the fourth one, still made those mysterious stops, still paused for 37 seconds between floors, still carried the sounds of voices and medical equipment. Margaret continued to record these sounds, building up hours of audio evidence. But when she tried to share her recordings with others, friends, family, even journalists, she found that the audio had become distorted, filled with static that made the voices impossible to understand. Over the following months, Margaret's life began to unravel. She started receiving phone calls in the middle of the night, silent calls that would last for exactly 37 seconds before disconnecting. She would come home to find her apartment rearranged in subtle ways. Books moved from shelf to shelf, furniture shifted by inches, food missing from her refrigerator. Her neighbors began avoiding her. The building manager started leaving notices under her door about noise complaints and lease violations. Her employer received anonymous complaints about her work performance. By September of 1994, Margaret had had enough. She moved out of the Meridian Tower and left New York entirely, relocating to Portland, Oregon, where she started a new life under a different name. But her story doesn't end there. In 2007, a construction worker named David Park was hired to do renovation work in the Meridian Tower. During his work, he discovered something in the building's ventilation system, a network of air ducts that led to a space between the 12th and 14th floors that shouldn't have existed. David reported his findings to the building management, but he was told to seal up the ducts and forget what he had seen. When he refused, he was fired and escorted from the building by security. David went to the media with his story, but the only coverage he received was a small article in a local community newspaper. The article was pulled from their website 3 days after publication, and David received a cease and desist order from the building's legal team. In 2011, a paramedic named Sarah Williams responded to a medical emergency in the Meridian Tower. An elderly resident had suffered a heart attack and needed to be transported to the hospital. Immediately, as Sarah and her partner were taking the patient down in the elevator made an unexpected stop. The doors opened to reveal a corridor that Sarah later described as looking like an old hospital from the 60s. Standing in the corridor was a figure in a white coat who gestured for them to bring the patient out of the elevator. Sarah's partner, who had been with the paramedic service for 20 years, seemed to know exactly what to do. He began wheeling the patient toward the figure in the white coat. Sarah tried to object, explaining that they needed to get the patient to a real hospital, but her partner told her to stay quiet and follow orders. The patient was taken into one of the rooms along the corridor, and Sarah never saw them again. When she tried to file a report about the incident, she was told that no such call had been logged, no patient had been transported, and no resident of the Meridian Tower had suffered a heart attack that day. Sarah quit the paramedic service 3 months later and moved to California. These stories might seem like isolated incidents, the product of stress, imagination, or mental illness, but there's a pattern here, a consistency that suggests something far more disturbing. What if the 13th floor of the Meridian Tower was never meant to be discovered? What if it serves a purpose that requires absolute secrecy? What if there are patients there who have been kept alive for decades, far beyond what nature intended? I've spent months researching this story, reaching out to former residents, city officials, and medical professionals. Most refuse to talk. Those who do speak off the record paint a picture of a system that extends far beyond a single building. They tell me that there are facilities like the 13th floor in cities across the country, hidden in plain sight, serving patients whose families believe they died years or even decades ago. They tell me that these facilities are funded through a network of shell companies and government contracts that are buried so deep in bureaucracy that they're virtually impossible to trace. They tell me that the people running these facilities believe they're doing important work, extending human life far beyond its natural limits, regardless of quality or consent. And they tell me that anyone who gets too close to discovering the truth finds their life systematically destroyed until they have no choice but to disappear. Margaret Chen died in 2018. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, but her friends in Portland insist that she was not suicidal. David Park disappeared in 2012. His family filed a missing persons report, but the investigation was closed after 6 months with no leads. Sarah Williams died in a car accident in 2015. The accident report noted that she had been driving erratically, as if trying to avoid something. But there were no other vehicles on the road. The Meridian Tower still stands. At the corner of East 42nd Street, it still has 12 floors, officially. The fourth elevator still makes those mysterious 37-second stops, though residents have learned not to talk about it. New tenants are carefully screened. Before being allowed to move in, they sign extensive lease agreements that include clauses about maintaining building confidentiality and not discussing building operations with outsiders. The building management company is owned by a subsidiary of a holding company that's controlled by a trust fund that's managed by a law firm that specializes in medical research liability protection. Harold Finch died in 1980, but his building remains, and the work he started continues. If you ever find yourself in a building where the elevator takes just a little too long to reach the top floor, if you ever hear sounds that don't quite belong, if you ever notice that the building has one more floor than it should, remember Margaret Chen. Remember David Park. Remember Sarah Williams. Remember that some secrets are kept secret for a reason, and that reason might not be what you think. The next time you're in an elevator, count the seconds, count the floors, and ask yourself, where exactly are you going? Because in some buildings, in some elevators, you might end up somewhere that doesn't officially exist. Meeting people who aren't supposed to be there. Discovering things that were never meant to be found. The Meridian Tower had only 12 floors, officially, but officially doesn't always mean actually. And sometimes, the truth is more terrifying than any fiction we could imagine.